Hi everybody, welcome to this week, part 4 of the Art of the Storyteller. Episode 8 even, of my video blog. Now that I'm actually finding to getting to do it every week, I'm actually losing track a little bit. I'm going to give you guys a hint, just a little hint of a project I've been working on with a very good friend of mine. It was a completely unexpected project and it came from just doing what I call writing jam. You know, that whole thing where you'll be using a form of instant messenger or email to just come up with a story, come up with some dialogue, come up with some showing, not telling, and see what develops. And we did that, and over the course of the past few weeks, something has actually quite significantly developed, actually. Something kind of exciting, something controversial, something very, very, very interesting, and I'm sure you guys will like it. There may be a sneak peek of some of it coming up fairly soon on the blog. Keep your eyes open for that. It's going to be very interesting. I'm just going to tell you, it's going to be like what I've written before, and it's not going to be like. It's going to be dark, it's going to be light, it's going to be fire, it's going to be darkness, it's going to be epic. It's probably the best way to put it, as epic as you could possibly get. Of course, fans, don't worry. The Hegemony trilogy and the Trinity trilogies are still coming. As you may be aware, my collection Yupo is coming out on December the 20th. It is now, right at this very moment, available for pre-order on Amazon. The paperback will be available through Amazon CreateSpace and all the usual channels within the next few days. I'm just waiting on that final review and perfection as far as the paperback is concerned, but the ebook is live now. The Amazon paperback, I may do that, but I wanted this one, seeing as it's a collection of poetry, to get a bit of a wider spread. And that's something to teach you guys as well, seeing as I'm here. How to market your book and why to use certain channels. As you may know, I use Amazon almost exclusively, the Amazon Kindle direct publishing system, which is completely free, and it allows you to create and upload both the ebook and the paperback of your book and make it available on Amazon. You may not be aware of channels such as CreateSpace, which has free extended release, which will also allow it to be ordered and available through bookstores and libraries, including Barnes & Noble. With this being a more general collection of poetry, I've decided to try and go through the more extended availability of this book. And that's something you guys might want to consider. Obviously, there are all the important things about establishing yourself as a writer, of creating your Facebook page, creating your online presence, creating your web page, creating your blog. You have to do those. There's no two ways about it. You have to have a web page, a Facebook author page, an Instagram page, possibly a Pinterest page, a blog. You have to have an Instagram. You have to have a way of making yourself known and available to the world. Otherwise, how the heck are they going to know about you? You know, it's a lottery out there. I may have mentioned this and I have opinions about it, but it's a big, busy world out there in the self-publishing world. You can look in your genre on Amazon right now, and I can guarantee you will find at least another 100 books competing in your genre right now. And how are you going to get visibility amongst those unless you start making sales? And how are you going to make sales unless you market yourself? You have to market yourself. It's vitally important. I do have on the Inkslingers Retreat and Wordsmith's Warren group a post which I will again pin. I just had my general rules pinned, but I will pin this post again once I get the chance. Facebook saw in its great wisdom to ban me from posting to groups, including my own group, for another week since last Sunday, which is what can you do? But what can you do? Nothing you can do. You can't beat Facebook. You need Facebook, and unfortunately you have to live with the consequences of using Facebook. I think I just posted a bit too much and they didn't like it, which is beautiful. when you're trying to market a major release and pre-release and a holiday deal like I'm doing. I guess I've got to use all the traditional methods and forget about Facebook until next Sunday, when I can go as mad as they will let me advertising in the last 3 days before actual release, but never mind. What can you do? Not a great deal. So I'm going to do that anyway. But let's get back to topic, shall we? So we are on part 4 of the art of the storyteller. Now, we have covered characters and how they behave, language and how that influences it, and location and how that influences that. We're coming to part 4 now, which is the story itself. Now, as I have learned, and as I have taught my friend this week, the hardest part of creating a believable full-length novel, whether you set it in today's world, whether you set it in a mythical world, whether you set it in a semi-mythical world, whether you set it in an alternate world, as I have done, you have to have something known as consistency. You have to do the hardest part of being a writer, which is actually coming up with a consistent, a believable world which has its own rules. Some writers have mentioned this, and as blasphemous as it may be seen to be, you are effectively God as far as your book goes. You decide who your characters are, what they do, what happens to them, which events take place, whether it rains, whether it snows, whether they die in chapter 5 or whether they have a narrow escape. You decide whether they meet their redemption or how their redemption comes. And that can get to your head if you don't keep a level one. You think, I can do whatever I like to this character. You get carried away and you lose the consistency, the realism, and the flow of the story. You have to realize that when you create a world, that world starts to develop its own rules and its own manner of doing things and its own ways of working and its own function. You have to make sure your characters and your events and everything you write stays true to that world. And that's part number 1 of writing a story, and it is the hardest part of them all, is actually coming up with the magical key, as I like to call it. That thing where you have your characters, you have some events, you have your conclusion in your head of what you would like to happen. What you need is the actual meat of the sandwich, the bits in between, what makes it all happen. And once you crack your world, once you have your rules, once you have your general flow, and you can make your world work, suddenly you have the magical thing happen. Everything just falls into place. And you think, oh my God, so X does this, and because of this is how this world is, and this is who he is, and this is what happens. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 happen to him, and Z comes in, and Y does this, and B does this, and A does that, and oh my God, I've got my story. And you realize all I have to do now, my story is here, I've just got to do the sequential part, and that's write each chapter. Once you've cracked that, you have something that happens that's called, as you may know, inspiration. I've mentioned it in my books before. Inspiration, and excuse me, I've still got a pretty bad throat, so if I cough a lot, I do apologize. Inspiration is what happens when your subconscious puts together all the little pieces of information that you had not yet come to realize were true. All those little details that your brain edits out, all those little things that didn't make sense, and then you can suddenly throw them all together in one sudden and insane order. Once you have your world and its rules, you have that order, you have those laws. And everything else can be made to fit into that order, fit into those laws, fit into those rules, including your characters. You can't be the all-creative writing God who makes everything happen unless those things you make happen actually make sense. And that's what tells a good storyteller from a bad one. A bad storyteller will want their story to take a certain direction, want their characters to go in a certain way, and they will just throw it all together, one event after the other. And okay, that makes sense. But you may or may not know that while most people will read fantasy, science fiction, other genres as an escape from their regular everyday lives, what separates a good piece of writing from a bad one is how the reader identifies with it. What sucks them in is when they see a bit of themselves in the characters. The books I have most loved are the ones that made me feel something, made me get to the end and think, it's over, what do I do now? That's what you're aiming for here. And how do you aim for that? You make your characters believable, and that to do that you have to have a system of a world that makes people give a damn about your characters. You can have a million cardboard cutout, two-dimensional piece of paper characters, and somebody could come up in chapter 10 and shoot said character in their head, and anyone really just go, so Mr. didn't do very much up until this point, apart from talk a lot, is dead. Or you can have your whole mythology, your whole laws, your whole society, everything in such a way that they're an important part of it. You can build tragedy, and it's not just from the world building like I was saying, but it's the way all the other three parts of this lesson have actually come up so far that do it. How you create your character, how he, she, it behaves, how he, she, it talks, how they interact and react with the scenes around them and the places, how the story rotates and flows around them, makes everything else gel and fit together. If you don't get that right, you'll get none of it right. Think about it this way. I am Irish, I come from an Irish history and Irish background, and a very important thing in Irish culture is the storytelling sessions that, we have our music, but we also have our storytellers. I've mentioned one in my articles. Mr. Ronnie Drew, God rest him, was a lovely, lovely man. He could sit there and he could captivate you for hours on end, talking about Mr. Brown going down the road and walking his dog. And the way he told it made you want to know what happened at the end of that walk. And even if Mr. Brown just went home and had a cup of tea, you enjoyed it anyway, because he would tell little jokes, little anecdotes, little details along the way, which made it compelling, which drew you in. And that's what you want to do. You can... Now here is a little bone of contention I have with several writing mentors, writing gurus. The rules of writing, as they are so often called now, that there are rules. We're artists. I can tell you where you can insert those rules and turn them into a very expensive suppository sometimes. Because the rules don't always work. The rules tell you, be brief, be quick, snappy, 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 machine gun delivery. Make it quick, make it not too detailed. I'd like to take a minute and think of the favorite book you have ever read, your most favorite book of all time. And tell me whether the rules you're being told to follow to be a successful writer were followed in that book or not. Just take a minute, think about it. Let me mention mine and tell you why. My favorite, at the age of 10 and a half, I got for my coming 11th birthday the anniversary edition of The Lord of the Rings. All three books, all appendices, everything else in one book. I read that from cover to cover in less than a month. And why? Because it drew me in. Many people criticize Lord of the Rings, but one thing Lord of the Rings has is detail. So much detail about characters, about places, about languages, about culture, about mythology, about everything. That for one, when Peter Jackson came to make the movies of Lord of the Rings, He had every piece of information he needed to make that world come to life. And for 2, you cared about what happened to every single character in that book. When Boromir was killed, saving the halflings, his redemption and his story made you care about his death. You didn't just think, oh, well, there's Sean Bean being shot through the variety of holes in him by orcs. That's a shame, never mind. No, he was a character. He was a central part of that story, and his influence didn't end with his death either. And that's how it is in the real world. There was another book I read, which I can never remember the title of, but they followed the theory that there was, when you died, you went somewhere. Not heaven, you went to a place, just like the world you had been in, except you never died. You lived your everyday life, you did all the things that you used to like doing, but you never had to worry about bills or dying, because you already had. And you stayed there, in this city, until the last person alive on earth who remembered you themselves died. And then you went, nobody knew where. Nobody said. Maybe it was heaven, maybe it was somewhere else. But you wouldn't actually die as long as you were remembered. So it happens, but it's true in the real world. If you die, people will carry on talking about you. Your family, your friends, people you had an influence on, they'll, even if they just think something happens that reminds them of you, and they go, oh yeah, he used to do that. You're still alive in their memory. You want your characters to keep on living in people's memory, even if they leave the book. Now, I'm going to throw it out here and probably make myself highly unpopular to some people. The series Lost. Think about that one. When did Lost finish? I think it was about 15 years ago or so. Right, I can't remember. I'll have to research that later and edit it in. But people are still talking about the ending now. Think about that for a minute. You may have hated the ending, but you're still talking about it. You're still talking about those characters. You're still talking about those stories. You're still talking about that narrative, even though it ended years ago and they've done nothing else since it ended. That's success right there, isn't it? People are going to be talking about that for years to come. Don't you want that? Don't you want your stories, your characters, your flows to be so compelling that people like my Irish storytellers would take someone else's stories, tell it in their style, add bits in until it became theirs, and then that story of that person will go on and on and on living as long as someone wants to tell it. And if I tell a story in such a way as it's compelling, it's exciting, it's interesting, another storyteller will hear it and think, hey, I'm going to make this my own and I'll tell it. And so on and so on and so on. And think about that for a minute. Think about how books that you like, people talk about them and ask yourself why they talk about them. Sorry about that, something happened with the light there. I suddenly went dark, but I'm back. Think about that. That's what you need to be doing. You can't just write things out really quick and hurry them out. You have to think. You know, I'm on this project that I write with my friend. We're on chapter 2 between us. 2 here, sorry. I already have a lot of events planned out. I have the fall, because you think about it, when you have a hero, what do you have? You have their beginning, their introduction. You have their expansion, their story. You have their fall. You have their rise. You have their victory. I've already walked through. I don't know what's happened with the light here. It's like it's flickering. Strobe effect, epileptics, beware. But I've got that planned out for this character already. And I haven't even wrote beyond the first chapter he appears in. How about that? I would know who he is, what his story is going to be, how his redemption is going to take place, how his life is going to pan out. And I haven't even read it yet, but I know how it's going to happen. So I can write that and make sure it's in there. You have to think about that when you're writing. This thing here, right here, is what you need to grab your readers by, and then you can grab them by, you can't see me, down here, the heart. Then you can grab them by that. But you have to plan out, play with them, manipulate them, drag them in this direction, drag them back, turn them around, do everything you possibly can to draw them in and make them care about your character, to turn them around, play them around, and suck them in. You're like the Sarlacc, you're like something like that, you're drawing them in. You have to know in here what's going to happen to your character, who your character is. Now, I made jokes about it in the first presentation a few weeks ago. You have to think as, you have to be able to hold a conversation with your character. Why? Because you have to know your character as well as you know yourself. You have to know what's going to happen to him, what she's going to do if you put her in a certain situation, what it would be like under certain circumstances. How he, she, it varies depending on who they are talking to. You have to breathe, live, and become almost that character. So they made jokes about us writers being schizophrenics or sociopaths, because we've got inside of our head not just our life, which we struggle to find time to do writing in, but the lives of every important character in our book. We know them as if they were members of our own bloody family, because you can't make someone real, believable, and compelling if you don't know what makes them tick. And that's the important part. You cannot have listened to the rest of these videos up to now and got to this one and not realized that everything is connected when you're writing, just like it is in the real world. If I speak to Mr. X, he'll tell Mr. Z this, and Mr. Y will come back and tell me that. It all has a knock-on effect. The same with your characters. If you have character X talking about character B to character D, and then character D goes to character A and tells her, and then character A comes back to your main character X and tells them her version, which may not necessarily be the same version. That will influence how your character reacts and behaves towards the other ones in that little scenario. And you have to realize that you can't just have each and every single one of your characters in isolation. They have to be all together, just like in the real world. Your setting, your story, they're the things that don't happen in the real world, because the real world doesn't tend to have happy endings very often. Not little neat, clean, joyous, happy endings where you get to page, however many pages it is, end of chapter X, and they all lived happily ever after, the end. That doesn't happen in the real world. I've done plays with it on my novellists, where I've wrote little side pieces and articles about things that happened in my novellas and what happened after. After the villain is shot in the head and the hero wins and rescues the girl, what happens when the police show up? When you see the sirens arriving and they're bundled up in the jacket, all wounded, what happens when the police come and want to know what's happened? They haven't read the book. They don't know what's happened. They are more than likely going to take your amazing hero to the jail for murder. And he may well go through a trial, and he may well go to jail. That's not a happy ending now, is it? But that's how the real world works. So you have to think about when you're writing, and that's why I do it. It's a little hint to those who are more sharp of mind and might pay attention to what I actually do. It's a little hint. When you're writing your book, you have to think beyond the final page. You have to think past the final word, the final full stop, the final period, the final exclamation mark, the final quotation mark. The next book, you have to think beyond. You have to think of what's going to happen next, and maybe you think that far ahead, you write a sequel. Maybe you don't. Maybe your next book falls into your creative world and universe. That's what happened with me. I thought so far beyond my short stories that I ended up writing novellas that I had never had any intention of writing, but playing around with what if, what next, made me write Scanda Draco, sorry. And then because I've written that, I had to write the other four. And now I actually have the beginning of the first hegemony novel written in my head, at least anyway, because I thought ahead and I planned ahead, and I've been playing around with beginnings for that novel for God knows how many years. And that's a little trick I'll give you too. You're having a problem with your character, you want you to make your character more believable. Write a short story about them. Write a novella about them, write a poem. Write an article on your blog about them, write a bio, write a character history. One thing that my novellas helped me do was give me background to all of my major characters. Alexander himself, Sham, Lupanikis, Nesha, and Kaliadis. I'll tell you, I started writing my novels and my universe 20 odd years ago. I had the idea. Alexander was then known as Marcus Cryptman. He was one of paternal twins. His brother was called Orantho. He had black hair. Very, very funny and punny, aren't I? He lived in the dragon was their deity. They were in a universe where they had an emperor. They were in the year 84,920, way off in the future. They had it was based loosely on the Roman Empire. It had genetically engineered super soldiers rather than draconically created super soldiers. And it was actually quite cool. It got a lot of good feedback from my family and my friends. But then, a few years into writing it, and when I'd actually finished book one, oh shock, horror, horrible, on a typewriter, on an electronic typewriter, on a real typewriter, on a computer. I had my manuscript all bound together nice and lovely. I'd done illustrations, I'd done everything. I'd done short stories about some of the major characters, some of whom have made an appearance under a slightly altered state in this book. Do you know the one character who has actually survived the cut into the hegemony universe rather than the Imperium, as I had it then? Alkemas Nesha. He's been changed a little bit. He's still a super soldier. He's still a Dracograth. The Dracograth and the Kalshadar all survived. Nesha is the only one who survived uncut, just because he was different. He represented an element that had nothing to do with what I'm coming up to in a minute, and I'll be back to this. Please bear with me. This is going to be a long one this week, and I apologize for you of short attention spans. I wrote short stories about all my major characters, and some events that I glossed over in the book, or some events that led up to the events in the book, I expanded upon in these books. Some themes I dealt on. All the major characters who would have major influence in the books, I had short stories about. Mr. Cryptman, who later went on to become split off into Kaliadis, Lupanikis, and Alexander. He had a backstory of several events that took place that he took part in, and they shaped him. The guy who went on to become the Carrig of the Dwarves, he makes an appearance, the very first one. Some characters who are going to come out later on in the novellas, who I will not ruin the surprise of, they did. So did Nesha. The scene where Nesha first gets introduced in the short stories, in the Seeker short story, in The Wandering Wanderer, that is in the original book. It is also in the short story specifically about Nesha and the Dracograph. It's just been changed a little bit to, I suppose I retrofitted it to fit the hegemony universe. Because I like Nesha, he's an interesting guy. I just changed him a little bit. And I changed his backstory and his everything. And you can do that too. You write short stories, look at work you've done in the past, see if you can fit it into your novel somehow, see if you can alter it to shoehorn one of the characters from your novel or your series into it, and change it and change them, or rework an old character, see if they can come into the novel somehow and be more interesting or part of that world. Now I'm leading up to this for a good reason. Why did I change everything? Because of a gaming system, a series of then to come novels, video games and some short movies called Warhammer 40,000. Please don't sue me, Mr. Jackson. I loved your Choose Your Own Adventure books and Death Trap Dungeon and the City of Thieves and all that, and the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I've got an original copy somewhere, so I love you. Please don't sue me. That came along and it was just too similar to what I had invented. So I couldn't use that. And I dithered and dabbled and got concerned and worried for almost 20 years. And I lost my creativity. Okay, one thing that came in handy is I invented Sham in the Trinity books during that time, but I couldn't get to finish them either. And it was writing the short stories, developing my short stories for the Alexander collections and doing the novellas, which answered all the questions I had been missing up until that point. And think about that. Your story is everything. Stuff you've written years ago and abandoned, characters you've left on the cutting room floor, things that have been edited out or changed. If you're stuck, go back to what we'll call our slush drawer and have a look. See what you can find. Read through your old notes, your old ideas, your old notebooks, your old files. Floppy disks if you've got them. CDs if you haven't. Online storage accounts you may have forgotten about. All of that stuff. It has worked for me so far. It can work for you too. And that's the thing that you have to think about as a storyteller. You never stop telling stories. It's in your blood, it's in your brain, it's in your heart, it's in your soul. If you're serious about this, you're serious about giving enough attention to catching flies, to detail, to make it work. And if you love it and have enough passion about it, you need to believe in your character so that you can make other people believe in them too. And that's it for this week. I've gone on way too far. It's going to take me an hour to upload this now, so please bear with me. But it's a pleasure as always. I will be back next week with whatever comes to mind. I am going to do this as probably a 10-part series, so we're getting there. We're almost halfway through. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for bearing with my sarcasm and my bad jokes and my odd wisdom. I've got some, I promise. See you next week, guys. Love you all. Take care.